I know our speakers, I hope our speakers will want to react to each other. There's a beautiful flow of issues over here that I hope they will want to find a way to engage. But before I open that to them, I want to open it up to all of you. If there are comments, questions, reflections you want to make, please give us your name and institution, and the mics come up to you. I'll take in 2 or 3 rounds. And of course, I will begin with John Conrad. John.
Thank you, Rajul. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. I was really fascinated by the indices and the historical trends across all of these presentations. And I was particularly curious about what kind of data the ERS has in terms of both transformation in terms of nutrition, because we hear a lot about that transition, but I didn't see it, and also about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, because I know there's been a big transformation in, in conservation agriculture, but I just wonder what those trends are.
John, thank you very much. I come next to Rob, and then I'll come to Derek.
Thank you. My name is Rob Vos of IFPRI. I have 2 questions, one for Maurício and one for Marcos. The first is to Maurício. I was very impressed by the change in Brazil and the transformation have taken place, both in terms of productivity and now the shift towards more sustainable agriculture. I'm very intrigued by your carbon-free meat. You rushed over it, but I would like to hear a bit more. How technologically that would work, but most importantly, is it economically viable? So my country, the Netherlands, recently they produced carbon-free eggs, very expensive to do now. So what does it take to make that economically viable? Because if it is not economically viable, then likely all the other factors will take over from the technology. And if I looked at the latest greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture numbers of FAO, for Brazil it's still increasing. So despite all the measures, so what needs to happen to make that economically viable? Similar question to Marcos about very interested what you said about vertical integration, because we know that's already happening. A lot of the food industry is vertically integrated in developed countries, but that's not a guarantee that use of natural resources will be more efficient. So linking that to your story about Brazil's deregulation and your new set of issues, wouldn't we need more and new regulation to make sure if you get to more vertical integration, it's also done in a sustainable manner?
Rob, thank you very much. Our third speaker question will be from Derek, another board member.
Hi, is that working? Yeah. My question, I think, well, thanks very much for very interesting presentations for everybody, but I think it's more for Marcos and Shenggen, and following up on Marcos' point of, doesn't make sense to be shipping whatever it is now, 50 million tons of soya beans to China in terms of value added for Brazil, in terms of the environmental cost of all of that. And what are the major constraints in integrating that supply chain? Is it from tariff protection or escalating tariff protection in China? Is it from food safety or other types of non-tariff barriers? What's really holding that back? And perhaps Shenggen could give us that from the what's the prospect that China would start opening up its meat industry?
Derek, thank you. Let me take one final question and then I come back to the panel, and that's with Steve at the back.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Stephen Lowry. I'm with C4, Center for International Forestry Research. So I'm the forest, carbon, and climate sort of issues in the mix here. I'm so pleased to see them feature so highly in the presentations related to Brazil. So these are really questions for Maurício and Marcos, and they relate to something that's from those of us in the forestry sector who study drivers of deforestation in the tropics, is the sort of what we understand to be significant success of the soy moratorium in Brazil, which were private sector commitments to eliminate deforestation from supply chains among major producers of soy in Brazil. These are all private, that is, with major soy buyers in North America. and in and in Europe. And research by Polly Higgs at Wisconsin and others suggests that there was sort of only 1% added over a 10-year period to forest loss on the part of those companies that had signed on to the moratorium. Done much better than, in fact, soy production under the Forest Code. There's been some advances achieved under the Forest Code from what we understand, but the private commitments are very, very significant. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And I think it's something of global consequence because the zero forestation commitments in these major commodities like timber, beef, soy, palm oil, in our view, hold some significant promise for reducing deforestation, reducing carbon emissions, and so on.
Steve, thank you very much. I'll come back to the panel in a moment. Online audiences, if you'd like to make any questions or comments, please send them in, and then we will have a person in the room read them out. Mary, why don't I begin with you, and then I will come to Maurício, Marcos, and Shenggen, and picking up on the questions in that order.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the question about greenhouse gas emissions. And the U.S. government reports over time the greenhouse gas emissions from all sources, including agriculture, and USDA contributes to that. It's done by a different office, but they draw on some of our farm survey data for those numbers. And I can follow up with you on where to find that. The question about nutrition is really interesting and what we know about nutrition. And I think it leads to a lot of the things we've talked about today in terms of supply chains and what's driving a transformation of global ag markets. So Americans all say they want to eat healthy. The data show that we don't. And one of the drivers is the demand for convenience. A big trend is the growth in eating away from home, which has grown from about 25% of the diet, I think, of consumption in the 70s to half right now. And we know that food eaten away from home from surveys and detailed work is much less healthy. So in general, we've seen worsening of diets in the U.S. over time. There was a blip during the Great Recession, in recent recession, when we, because of less income, ate more at home. We saw actually a notable improvement in diets, but as incomes have recovered, we've started eating more away from home, and we see also in supermarkets more convenience food. And I think the demand for this both health but also convenience is driving a lot of the integration and new products that are being built, and this change in the system that's having an influence on farming, as well as the demand for characteristics like low carbon or sustainable. And in some ways, this could be a driver we're not well measuring of why there's profitability in being larger. Maybe that allows you to be more profitable in this new food system that's emerging.
Thank you, Maurício.
Yes. Thank you for the question on carbon neutral beef. But before discussing carbon neutral beef, I think it's important to point out that a more complex agricultural production system is a tendency in Brazil because we have very large areas, for instance, of degraded pasture. Cattle production in Brazil still runs with very low productivity. So there is space there for us to improve a lot the productivity of cattle production. One way to move to get this improvement in productivity is by having more complex production systems, bringing, for instance, soybeans, followed by corn, followed by pastures, and cattle. That give a density to the agricultural production systems and rentability that allow farmers to bring this degraded land into production with high productivity, releasing pressure over new environments like forests. We don't want to deforest anymore. Brazil doesn't want to cut one more tree. There is no need to. We have 50 to 60 million hectares of degraded pastures with very low productivity. And all this land can eventually enter into a more complex production systems, combining crops livestock and also forestry to help us release the pressure on environments that have to be protected. This is the most important aspect of it. Dealing with this issue of deforestation, which is something that unfortunately Brazil is very visible in relation to sustainability, the deforestation, and things are changing and changing fast, and we think that this, for the image of the country and the narrative that we must build for the future, is a must for Brazil. Obviously, the possibility to have a production which is carbon neutral, it comes as an added value to all of this. So we still can do an intensified use of the land, having production which eventually can be certified as carbon neutral. It is always feasible or economically viable? Probably not. In some situations, it may not be. It depends also how you calculate economic feasibility, how a certificate of carbon neutral will be valued in 5, 10, or 15 years. We don't know. Probably will be very much valued. So in some areas, it may not be economically so attractive because you have a more complex agricultural system now. Farmers that used to handle only cattle, now they have to handle soybeans, they have to handle brachiaria, they have to handle cattle and forestry. So it's definitely a more complex system that will demand more complex management. It costs also. But what we have to do is to bring the right metrics to help farmers to take the best decisions. And that's what the research organizations in Brazil are doing right now. But the growth of integrated systems in Brazil is showing that, yes, the system is attractive. We evaluated the expansion of integrated systems in Brazil in 2015, and we reached the number of 12 million hectares. We probably have today around 15 million hectares of integrated systems in Brazil, signifying this, that farmers are getting more and more attractive to this production paradigm. And we have no doubt that this production paradigm will have a profound impact in agriculture in the tropical belt of the world in a few years. So we believe that.
Thank you very much. Marcos?
The answer of the carbon neutral meat is intensification, as Maurício said. And intensification comes exactly because of this possibility to do several things at the same time in the same land, such as double cropping corn and soy without irrigation, then integrating with the forestry sector. In the same region in the Center-West, we have chicken, pork, sugarcane, cotton. All those activities competing for land in the Cerrados region. So this is what makes the revolution of the carbon neutral meat. And what we have here is a challenge to integrate more, not only horizontal integration between different activities in agriculture, but also vertical integration in terms of farmers, processors, and you see distribution, which is happening also very well in some sectors, such as chicken and pork, for example, is probably the best case that we are integrating more and more because we needed to export to 150 countries that are open for us. Not all of them are easy, but there's a lot of challenges in terms of obviously quality and also the food safety area. So this makes also the integration, the vertical integration. What's missing here is the international integration. That's exactly what you asked me. What about the international integration? Today, we are just supplying soybeans, which is used to feed animals in China, basically. So we are just in the first step of a very complex chain with a lot of contracts, a lot of challenges, but we are supplying just the feed part. We cannot supply meat. We only have 60 plants allowed to enter in China. And we have a total of almost 4,000 plants in Brazil, meat plants in Brazil. So very little plants are allowed to enter in China. There are all kinds of barriers. We have tariffs, we have also sanitary restrictions, we have technical restrictions, and we have bureaucratic restrictions, which it takes a lot of time to approve plants because there is no deadlines, there is no transparency in the system. So there's very little integration. So I think the big challenge for us is to really integrate not only in a vision of supply chain, but in a vision of value chain. And value chain goes much beyond the supply of feed. Value chain means that we are looking the whole chain and we are trying to maximize not only the profits, but also carbon, water usage, energy, etc. And Asia, the countries of Asia, the countries that are between China, India, and Indonesia, they represent 52% of the population. But they have only 20% of the water and 20% of the land. So there is a structural lack of resources in Asia. If we integrate this to South America now and Africa in the future, we have a solution. But this is not happening today because China is today looking for soybeans. China is not looking for meat. China is not looking for value-added products. So this is a huge challenge for us is to go ahead with all those studies that IFPRI is doing, Embrapa could do, and talk more about sustainable trade, not only sustainable production, but also sustainable trade.
Yeah, first, let me ask Mary and other speakers a question in terms of total factor productivity. Well, I think Gerardo is here. So I think right now we measure total productivity as output, either measured as GDP or gross value, inputs, capital, labor, land. But I think in the future, when we measure TFP, we should really measure the output as nutrition, as health. That's a challenge too, how do you measure that? Input side, let's also include water, carbon emission, or many other environmental externalities. So then you really have a TFP that reflects the whole societal health impact value. So that's a challenge to you. You guys can answer that. Can we do it? Should we do it? That's one. Including trade too, right? Now, why China wants to import soybean instead of meat? Actually, they do import meat now. I think a couple of reasons. I have not done a study. One is obviously they wanted to retain jobs in China, processing, all these things create jobs. Okay, economic activity, that's one. Second, you might not know the Chinese want to eat fresh meat. Fresh meat. Okay, chicken, pork, you have seen that, right? They sell the pork. But can you provide, let's say, fresh meat from Brazil or US to China? I think if you do that, I think Australia was doing that on beef. Yes, so I don't know what technology, basically fresh meat to the Chinese market in probably in a couple of weeks. So that actually really helped. Then the other reason is actually oil. For soybean, the Chinese also need oil. You know, it's the same thing. Whether you import the whole, let's say, soybean or oil and meat. So I think there are many reasons. But I do believe some of the non-trade barrier is a problem. You know, the China and the US now potentially is going to have a war. Now, actually China even didn't impose a soybean tariff, 25%. You already see the contracts have been canceled, delayed, because there are lots of other barriers, right? They can harass you. They can, you know, so that sort of thing happens in many, many other sectors, not just soybean. And soybean could be a trade and bargaining sort of techniques, you know, so I can import certain things high tech from you, but meantime I also import soybean. If not allow me to do that, then I'll stop importing soybean. So it's not just the economic reason, there are many other political reasons as well.
Mary, did you want to reflect quickly on the TFP challenge?
I think you're setting out a challenge for the profession of economist and agricultural economist, and one that we've taken up at ERS on the side of measuring more the inputs into production and a broader set of natural resource inputs, and have done some work on that. It hasn't yet reflected in official statistics, but we've partnered with other countries, and Keith Fugley and his colleagues are working to see what progress can be made. And there are definitely data challenges. On the nutrition side, I think that's a very intriguing idea, and hopefully our profession will respond and, you know, put out more work that we can think about for where we go with statistics in the future.
Thank you, Mary. Mauricio, you wanted to reflect.
No, I just want to bring a new layer of complexity here, which is exactly, I think we are talking about a complex world today, and maybe a world that will become even more complex in the future. When we talk about the paradigm of trade that Marcos is describing, we are certainly talking about a more complex world, more complex institutions. And I think the real questions that we have today is, do we have the institutions, do we have a paradigm of relations that will allow us to handle the complexity of the world with the degree that this complexity is coming towards us? We are talking about a sustainable future. We are talking about efficiency. We are talking about a low-impact, low-carbon economy. Is it possible to think about this paradigm of production or of development without a new concept of integration or dialogue or institutions? We had multilateral organizations in the past, which I think tried to accomplish this goal, how to deal with complexity in a world full of competition, full of verticality instead of transversality. I don't think we have such a system anymore, or at least a system with the efficiency that we had in the past. And I think we need to think about a new system, considering the challenges that we have from here to 2030, which is the limit of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I know that this is a complicated discussion, but I think we are talking exactly about this here. What kind of institutions or what kind of paradigm for interaction, for dialogue, and for interaction that we need to aim for this sustainable world, decarbonized, low impact, efficient, that we are all looking for.
Mauricio put a very key challenge on the table that I hope we will have a chance to reflect. But let me do one final round with the audience here and online. And Pamela, do we have online? Why don't we take the online first? And I'm cognizant of time, so I will be sadly rude. But let's see what we can do. Pamela?
Okay, I have some diverse questions here. The first one is about Embrapa. And the question is, what is the role of GMOs in Embrapa's research today? Second question is about the role of loans in agricultural transformation. What is the role of loans? Okay. And the final question is about population growth, and notes that there's enormous population growth in Africa projected by the year 2050. We've talked about Asia and Brazil integration, but what about policy, procurement, and market initiatives for different African countries?
Pamela, thank you very much. Let me come back to the room if anybody wishes to make any comments or reflections. I see a hand back there, and I see a hand in the front. Please tell us your name also.
Yes, my name is Philip Schell. I recently retired from U.S. Department of Agriculture, Foreign Ag Service. Very interested to hear the comments and the need for improving institutions, and wondering if you can make that link to public education. It's always seemed to me that a common challenge we are all facing is the combination of unprecedented urbanization with unprecedented prosperity, because the former makes us ignorant of what's happening in agriculture, for example, the opposition to GMOs, et cetera. And the second makes us complacent. You get people who today are willing to pay 3 or 4 times the price to have unpasteurized milk and are happy to pay $7 for 1 tomato as long as it's natural. And so these are the things, how we improve public education and reduce some of that opposition to new technology in agriculture. Thank you.
V. Rajagopal, former director of the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, India. And I have just some comments to make, not the questions, about the transformation of agriculture in India for the last 4 or 5 decades, having worked in the Indian Council of Agricultural Research. Although I got many points, just I would like to make 2 or 3 important policy decisions that the government has taken in recent years about the horticulture mission, because we are having one of the best agro biodiversity in the world with different crops that can be grown throughout the year. And another challenging ones which I myself have worked is on the mixed farming, integrating the crop varieties, livestock and fisheries and all that. And then the recent, you all might have seen in the newspapers about the government's initiative, policy decision on doubling the farmer's income in India through various development of technologies. And I'm proud to say that the Village Knowledge Center, of course, which was started by M.S. Swaminathan Research Foundation, in which I happen to extend myself to the extension agencies. The women empowerment development is quite interesting, where many women have started the self-help groups, SHGs, to improve production of agriculture and agricultural variations. And last but not the least, I got the most challenging problem, as you all might have seen, is the malnutrition in India, with high percentage of anemia and then the children with. And then the government has come recently with a national nutrition mission, and it already has a national health mission. So there's a linkage between agriculture, then the health, nutrition and all that, and in which I have been able to contribute in terms of the Society for Hunger Elimination, for which I am the founder president, and trying to do some of the things on the transformation of agriculture in total. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll have another event where we can bring the Indian experience with transformation to the table. Let me take the final comment with Astrid from the German Embassy.
Thank you very much. I really would like to thank for this very inspiring event. Great. I would be interested in the role of the ITC. It was a little bit mentioned in the beginning. We know that in the US, for example, precision farming, but much beyond even precision farming, is playing a major role. So I would like to know how is this in Brazil, and how is access, especially for all these small farmers, to these technologies, and is this something which can be then brought to Asia, where there might be even bigger problems to have access to these technologies? Thank you.
Panelists, we have an incredible challenge ahead of you, and I will ask you, pick the questions that you feel you can respond to, and then you can continue offline conversation. And I'd like to begin in the order of Maurício, Mary, and Marcos, and then give Shenggen the concluding remarks.
Yes, very quickly on the GMO. There is no way to think about farming in the tropical belt of the world without technology. When you think about land, labor, and technology, in the 1996, technology was responsible for 51% of generation of wealth in agriculture in Brazil. In 2006, the value jumped to 68%. So all this development that we had in tropical agriculture in Brazil was basically due to the quick incorporation of knowledge and technology, including GMOs. Brazil has a very sophisticated biosafety legislation that with very secure and very careful evaluation of impacts, and GMOs have, yes, a big impact on modern agriculture in Brazil, including in sustainability of our agriculture. The control of weeds in a tropical country like ours without a GMO would cost a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and this is all measured. Obviously, if the technology is used with the due care, with a good biosafety evaluation, there is no problem in using the new technologies. And we have a new wave now with gene addition that promises a lot more interesting things, more sustainability, more efficiency, more quality to our products. In terms of information technology in tropical agriculture, it's amazing what's going on right now with the new sensors, with the machines that will help us understand better the reality of the farm. We anticipate that in a very a few years, a drone will go to the field loaded with a chip, with an algorithm that will allow this drone to spot a weed and go there and spray herbicide only on top of that weed. As a matter of fact, Embrapa is developing a project with Qualcomm right now to do exactly that. Artificial intelligence that will be loaded in these amazing machines that will give us unprecedented power and capacity to raise the sustainability of our systems to levels that we could not even dream a few years ago. So the potential is enormous. The number of startups, of young people being attracted to agriculture because of this revolution, the information technology, the transformation that the new tools are bringing to agriculture is impressive, amazing. And I have no doubt that this will be also a big revolution in the near future.
Thank you, Maurício. Mary?
Yes, let me take the question on credit and loans. And as you look at the changes in the U.S. towards more capital intensity and more purchased inputs, this requires access to credit as part of the transformation. So that has been an important part of the story in the U.S., and the U.S. Department of Agriculture has served as a lender of last resort in the agricultural sector and continues to do that. USDA still operates multiple programs to provide credit to the ag sector.
Thank you. Marcus?
Let me make my final remarks about Africa and Asia and the links to South America and to Brazil. First, Africa. I think the major lesson from Brazil, from the Brazilian experience, is the agricultural transformation that we had, that happened in Brazil. And the reason of this transformation is first the tropical technology, but second, the skilled farmers, young and skilled farmers in Brazil. This was very important. The guys who came from Europe 100 years ago, they had sons and grandsons, and these people migrated to the Center West and had the opportunity to have economies of scale there. So this movement is something that we should talk in Africa. I don't know how we can incorporate the Brazilian experience there, but the experience of education of those farmers, young farmers, and migration and economies of scale is extremely important in tropical areas. It's probably the only solution in tropical areas in the long term. And I think that the debate in Africa sometimes is a little lost in terms of these areas. You see, skilled farmers and scales. Finally, to Asia. The word in Asia is not transformational agriculture because this is happening, especially in China today. But the big experience in China is not in meats, Shenggen. The big experience in China is in fruits and vegetables. This is really amazing what China is doing in fruits and vegetables, which absorbs a lot of labor with very high tech. In terms of meat, China will import meat, even if they prefer fresh meat. You see? And the reason is very simple. because there is a difference of fresh meat in poor countries and you see fresh meat in rich countries. In Europe, they are not eating meat because they want free range, they want organic, they want no antibiotics, they want to be vegetarians. It's completely different. When you go to fresh meat in poor countries, they eat fresh meat because they don't have refrigeration, first of all. And if you don't have refrigeration, you cannot eat frozen meat. You cannot eat processed meat. You see, it's much more complicated because you need that. So the movement I saw in Asia during 4 years, working for a meat company there, was people want to eat meat, but they don't have integrated food chains in Asia. So they cannot find good meat in the markets, in their houses. And this movement is happening everywhere. This will happen even in India. India is a vegetarian country, but you see a movement of, increasing meat consumption in chicken, for example, in India. And we have this in China very strongly. So in my opinion, this will happen. The problem is the speed of this change, because we see all the Chinese companies moving to grains today. You have A, B, C, 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 D now, no, correct? You have a lot of Chinese companies entering in the A, B, C, D world, ADM, Bunge, Cargill. Chinese companies will be there, but these same companies will go to genetics, to GMOs, and will go to meat in the future. The question is when we are going to see this integration. It will take 20 years, 30 years, or it will happen in the next 5 years through a discussion about value chains, not only supply chains, as I mentioned before. So I think the big challenge on the discussions between South America and Asia is how to create sustainable value chains in the agri-food sector between Brazil and Asia, South America and Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Shenggen?
Well, it has been a wonderful discussion. And there's no doubt that we have achieved a great deal in the past in agriculture food system, technological innovation, trade, even institutional reform. So that's why we have reduced hunger, malnutrition, poverty substantially for the last several decades. But today, our food system, agriculture system, still face some challenges. I think the climate change, hunger, malnutrition, the degradation of natural resources. So what do we want? Yes, we do want to have a more integrated food system, global food system. Trade, open trade is very much part of that. Innovations, new innovations, not just in agriculture, food sector, I think outside of the agriculture sector. ICT, AI, that can be used in agriculture sector, in food system to transform our food system. But we also wanted to make sure that that food system is very inclusive. Women, youth, children must benefit from that system. So, and to do that, I think the knowledge sharing, South-South learning, we don't have any presentation on Africa today. I hope in the future we could have one, not just big giants, US, China, or Brazil, or maybe even India. I think the Africans needs to be here. That's what I worry in the future. The population growth, somebody mentioned about the population growth in Africa. Yes, they will demand lots of food, lots of good food. People will move to cities. To me, that's one of the greatest challenges that we all have to work together. With that, I thank you very much. Thank you for coming over here. And Rajul, I think if you have any questions, any sort of comments, you can send it to us, right, by or virtually through email or through online platform. Great.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers today and Geraldo.